Welcome to Housing Now. In fact, this is a special edition of Housing Now. With us today, we have Dr. David Crow, NHB's chief economist, who's here to give us his perspective on the economic state of the housing industry.
This is David Crow. I'm the chief economist at National Association of Home Builders. So happy to give you a little review of what's going on. I want to start with where we are right now, sort of the last several months of housing starts. So you can see from the slide that we haven't been doing very well this year. We really have been operating in the low 900,000 range. We certainly expected much better. And so we thought maybe we were seeing some end of that slump for the winter doldrums. But in fact, we weren't. We still continued with that kind of mediocre response. The very last report from the Census Bureau does seem to be a little bit better. We finally passed the million mark again, although you will notice that the red bars are where we see the largest amount of variation. That's the multifamily sector. The blue levels are the single family sector, and they've been relatively level, just over 600,000. So my presentation is based upon why would you think they're going to be better? So I want to give you 3 points that show you why I think there is good optimism ahead. So the first one of those is the labor market. And what I want to show you there is, first of all, while that has been a little erratic, we have added 6 million jobs in the last 2.5 years. Sometimes that's been a little bit slower than others, but the last few months have been very good, except for the most recent. We've had over 200,000 added jobs every month. The most recent one in August was a little softer than that, but I'm not taking too much concern over that. I think we're still on track to see this 200 plus. And that's important because that's really what housing is waiting for. If you look at individual markets, those that have seen strong job growth have seen strong housing growth. It's almost a perfect correlation, and vice versa, unfortunately. So this job growth is really the key to this recovery. It's different from last recoveries where housing is usually the motivator. This is one in which economic expansion and jobs are what's going to get us moving forward. You also will notice from this graph that during the same period when we've had an increase in jobs, we've also had an increase in weekly salary. This is an estimate from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but it does give us a sense that not only are we adding jobs, but we're adding jobs that pay a little bit more. And so that same expansion of 6 million jobs has also meant an expansion of about $10 billion in weekly payrolls. So that's also helped our economy move forward. Now, paying attention to unemployment is probably not helpful. Yes, the unemployment rate has continued to fall, but it's really a misleading indicator. And the reason for that is because we've had a lot of people drop out of the labor force. So this graph is participation rates, essentially how many people are either working or looking for a job out of the total population. And as you can see, it fell during this recession, and it fell because people got discouraged, particularly young people. Some of them went back to school to earn a different degree, to earn more information, to more education, to be able to move forward. But a lot of them just said, I give up. I can't find a job, so I'm not even going to look anymore. And that participation rate meant that we were dealing with fewer people that could otherwise have been unemployed. That seems to have leveled out. The right-hand side of that graph, you can see where we seem to have bottomed out. So while we haven't moved up again, while we haven't brought those discouraged workers back into the marketplace yet, at least we don't seem to be getting worse. And so again, another piece of evidence that the employment market is beginning to cure itself, and we're going to begin to see some more expansion. It is different, though, as it has been in the case of all the housing activity. The employment market is very different from state to state. So I have 2 maps to show you that kind of compare those differences. This one compares where that state is relative to its peak. And so all the green colors say that those states are back up above where they were at their peak of employment, which was sometime in late 2007. The U.S. as a whole is finally there. We finally have employed as many people now as we had at the peak of the boom in 2007. But as you can see, there's quite a bit of variation. And in fact, those states that took the big hit in terms of either their local economies, like the manufacturing sector in the Midwest, or some of the sand states, are still struggling to get back to where they were. But the next map shows you who's been moving the fastest most recently. And what that says is many of those darker colored states, those red and orange states in the previous map, are now green. So they finally have started to grow. They still aren't back to where they were at the peak, but they're starting to grow much more significantly in some of the other states. They're catching up. So that's another good sign that we're finally beginning to see this revival spread to the hinterlands, if you will, to the states that had the biggest problems. And so we're beginning to see this more broadly felt. Not everywhere, so unfortunately there are a few states that are red in both cases. So let's move on to the next sector. What about consumer sentiment, buyer sentiment, builder sentiment? And so the consumer sentiment can be measured in a couple of ways. The University of Michigan does one, Conference Board does one. They both tell you about the same thing, and that is, if you look at the dotted line, we're back up to the level of sentiment, the level of comfort, the level of confidence in the economy that we were right before the collapse. So that's a good sign. We have other evidence. For instance, people are spending more money than ever on household furnishings, things that you could otherwise postpone. We had a very good month last month in car sales. People are feeling comfortable. That cloud of doubt, that concern about their economic future is beginning to diminish. And so obviously the next step for them is to purchase a home or to rent an apartment, depending upon where they are in their lifestyle. Same thing is true of business people, of small business. National Federation of Independent Businesses publishes a sentiment survey, and they too have seen pretty similar responses as have consumers. And then finally, our own survey, the NEHB Wells Fargo Housing Market Index, has seen a nice, strong recovery. We did see a dip earlier in this year, that same level of lack of confidence that we saw in the first graph when housing starts sort of slumped in the early part of the year did affect builder sentiment, and so we saw a little bit of softening in February through the early spring, but that has bounced back as well. And so as you know, anything over 50 indicates that more builders feel good about the market than feel poor. So we've gotten that same signal from builders. So the collective conclusion here is that there is a general increase in comfort level that we haven't seen before in this recession. So let's go to the third piece, and that is affordability. So first of all, I want to tackle interest rates. Yes, they're not 3.5% anymore. Oddly, they have softened significantly, so they probably jumped a whole percentage point between last year and this year, and then softened again. That softening is mostly due to international discomfort and fright over all of the things that are happening in different countries, and so the flight to safety has meant a lot more investment, particularly in U.S. Treasuries, and so we've actually suppressed our interest rates a bit for a while. That's not going to last. We'll resolve these issues eventually. Other countries will seem like a good investment as well, and so rates will go back up again. In fact, they will go up significantly over the next couple of years simply because we're having an expanded economy. And so there will be other forces that will want to borrow money as well as home buyers. And so we're going to see a gradual rise in interest rates. The reason I put this longer history on there is to simply give you that comfort level that even if they do go up to 5% by the end of 2015 and 6% by the end of 2016, they're still relatively low by historic standards. And besides all that, as I've told you before, the real issue here is not the price of credit, it's the availability of credit. And so as long as we have these extraordinarily tight underwriting standards, the real issue is, can I get a mortgage rather than can I afford a mortgage? I do think that will begin to soften a bit. Some of the regulations behind the Dodd-Frank legislation are finally being published. While unfortunately we don't have any conclusion in the Congress over what to do about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, there are some other measures being taken by the new director of OFEO that seem to suggest that we're maybe at least a little softening in some of those really restrictive standards. So I'm expecting that there will be a little bit of counter movement to the underwriting standards that will adjust for the fact that the rates are going up a little. So that's not a particular concern. Yes, there will be some people who will be priced out because of that, but in general, that isn't a major concern. And so we use the NAHB Wells Fargo Housing Opportunity Index as a means for measuring this affordability issue. And as you can see, it has come down a little, down meaning less affordable, but not a great deal, and certainly still well above that kind of 50 mark. This is a very simple measure. What share of the homes recently sold can a typical household afford? And we use the median income to represent a typical household. So in this case, a typical household could afford 63% of all the homes recently sold. Reasonably good, certainly much better than during the boom. And then finally, house prices. And so they, of course, these are two representative indexes of several different ways to measure house prices. They shot up during the boom, collapsed during the bust, and now they are gradually returning again. I think two things to mention here. Number one, that gradual returning will soften a bit. And so with rise in inventory in both the new and existing market and a little bit of waning of the hot investor demand will mean we won't have quite as much a push on the existing inventory of homes for sale, and therefore we shouldn't see quite as hot a rise in the prices. They were rising at almost 20% during 2013, and that softened down to lower than 10% during 2014, and that should continue. And so that will, it's kind of a double-edged sword for those people that own a home. It means they're getting more equity. It means in some cases they now have positive equity. So those things are both very positive. On the other hand, if it's a first-time home buyer, it means they're having trouble getting back into the market. So house price movements sort of have both a positive and a negative. Let's turn to the forecast. Three pieces of our industry: remodeling, multifamily, single family. In remodeling, we're doing okay. Part of the reason we're not seeing large increases is simply because we're pretty much back to where we should be. We've sort of regained the much smaller collapse in remodeling than there was in new construction. We are benefiting from a few tax credits that still exist, although that pushed us forward much more in the past than it will in the future. And we're seeing this added equity, so people are willing to put more money into their homes because they're more valuable. So unfortunately, we lost some ground in the early part of this year, and so we're not going to end up with a positive movement for the year, although we will continue to move forward from this point and regain some of the ground we lost in the same bad winter that the rest of housing lost as well. In multifamily, that of course has been the star of the show. It fired off almost immediately after the recession was over because of this strong demand for rental apartments by the younger generation. Those people that have formed household, even though they're smaller in number than we would expect, have exclusively gone to being renters. And so we've had a very strong demand for rental production, and therefore we're already back up to the levels we saw during the late 90s and early 2000s, and we'll exceed those. We will go from a national production level of somewhere around 340,000 units to probably 370,000 units before we level off and continue at that rate for a couple of years. That's just the nature of this new kind of housing demand. And then finally, the single-family side, of course, that's been the one that's been the hardest to push forward. You saw that from the Housing Market Index. We're really only halfway back to what we should be. We should be producing about 1.3 million units a year. We're barely at halfway of that. I do see that because of those positive signs I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, a strong economic recovery, decent job recoveries, and reasonable conditions in the housing market. I do see some strong expansion next year and the following year as we try to catch up. Of course, it is different. And in fact, if you were to compare this map to the employment map I gave you, the first employment map, the one about where we are relative to the peak, you would see a similar coloring, and that is those states that sunk the most, that had the biggest damage to their economy from the collapse, are the states that are still hurrying to catch up. Whereas those states that have really strong economies and didn't have as disastrous a collapse, particularly those states in the energy belt from the Texas north, are the ones that are doing well because they didn't have as much damage and continue to move forward. Thank you very much. I hope this has been helpful.